Okay, so in this chapter, we're going to be looking at navigating in 3ds Max. And we're really not going to be looking at anything complicated here. I just want to ensure that you have the easiest time possible navigating around in 3ds Max and you use the most efficient workflow possible. So we're just going to look at some really basic things here, and I just want to make sure that you're aware of a number of different elements that will just make your life a lot easier when you're working in 3ds Max. This is very important for general work in 3ds Max, and it's doubly so for when you're modeling, because when you're modeling, you're going to be creating objects, moving them around, and doing a lot of dynamic things which really rely on you having a good control of Max. And in some cases, these are going to be actual features of Max, and in other cases, they're going to be tips and best practices from me. So it's going to be a mixture of the two. Okay, so the first thing I'd recommend is that you use one viewport. In some cases, you may want to actually use multiple viewports while you're modeling, but I generally find it's a good idea to use just one viewport because it gives you the biggest view possible of the object that you're modeling on. So you can just click down here and toggle to a full screen display. Now, when you're in this mode, you can actually change to the other views very easily using a number of keyboard shortcuts. And later in this DVD, I'll show you a lot of keyboard shortcuts, but for now, I'll just show you some of them. If you want to change to the top viewport, press T. If you want to change to the bottom viewport, press B. If you want to change to the left, press L. If you want to change to user view, you can press U. P for perspective mode. And if you've got any cameras in the scene, you can press C, and it'll come up with a dialog that lists all the cameras, and then you can choose which camera you want to look through. So it's very easy to change views when you're in expanded single view display like this. And if there are any keyboard shortcuts which are missing for certain views, for instance, back in the day, you could change to the right viewport by pressing R, but these days it's actually used as a transform keyboard shortcut. So if you want to do, you can create your own version of the right view keyboard shortcut. I believe at the moment it's Alt R. Yeah, so if you press Alt R, you can actually change to right view. But it's not as easy to remember as some of the others maybe. So you can actually set up your own keyboard shortcut for that if you need to. In terms of navigating around the viewport, if I hold down Alt and middle mouse button and move around the camera, you can see that it actually orbits around the scene, actually moves around in 3D space, actually pivoting around a central point in your scene. If I hold down the middle mouse button and I move around, you can see it actually pans the viewport. And I can also zoom in by pressing Control and Alt and middle mouse button, that zooms in and out. And I can also do the same by using the wheel on my mouse to actually zoom in and out by scrolling it back and forth. I can zoom in steps. So you can see you've got a number of different options for actually navigating around in your viewport in that respect. Now, when I create an object, I'm just going to create a teapot here. We can move that object around by pressing W. We'll choose move, the move tool, and it produces this little gizmo here. So I can move the teapot like this. Just grab these handles to move it. And I can choose these planes here to move in a plane. As you can see, that's with W to actually choose that option. If I press E, I get rotation. And again, I can move in all planes at once, or I can actually limit it to one axis just by grabbing that wheel and moving it. There we are. And if I change to scale by pressing R, then again, we have a number of options. We can scale on one axis just by grabbing one of these arms, or I can do just one plane at once by grabbing one of these strips, which actually represent that plane, as you can see. And I can also do a uniform scale, in other words, all axes at the same time, by selecting the center triangle. And a really cool tip is if you're doing any of these transforms, you can actually cancel the transform by clicking on the right mouse button while you're in the midst of the transformation. So as an example, if I wanted to scale this object and I didn't like that scale, I can just right click and it cancels that transformation. I can move it on an axis, right click, and that will cancel that transformation. I can basically cancel any transformation just by right clicking and it'll just get rid of that transformation for me. Then if I want to focus on an object, let's say I'm over here and I want to look at this object, I can just press Z and Max will zoom in on that object and it'll center it in the viewport. If I have multiple objects, let's just create a few more teapots. just holding down shift and dragging there to create a new teapot. Hold down shift, drag, do this a few times. Now, if let's say I'm here and I have nothing selected and I press Z, what Max will do instead is it will actually zoom out so it shows the entire scene. And that means it will actually draw a box around all of these objects and create a cube and then make sure that you're outside that cube so you can see everything in your scene in one go. Now, in some circumstances, you can actually have a situation where you don't want to zoom out to actually see all of these teapots. You want to basically put them outside the scene. And what you can do with that is actually go to the display panel, which is here. Go down to display properties, which you can see here, and you actually have to have something selected for them to be active. So I'm just going to select all of these teapots, and I'm going to go to ignore extents and turn that on. And what that does is it tells Max that when you're doing a zoom to extents, which is what you're doing when you press Z, with nothing selected, to ignore any objects which have this ignore extents turned on. So if I press Z now, it just zooms in on this one teapot, because all these other teapots are basically classed as being outside the scene, so it just ignores them. I can turn that back on again, just select everything, turn off ignore extents, and now when I zoom, it shows all these objects again. Now, one more tip about navigation, and this is something which is optional, and some people like it, some people don't. You can change the way that you orbit around the scene by pressing, Alt and middle mouse button. I'm orbiting. Well, as you can see, it's orbiting around a kind of center, which is just in front of our view. And for a lot of people, that's great, but other people really want to kind of orbit around the object that they're working with. So if you go down here, you've got different options here for the orbiting, which is called arc rotating. And you can actually change it from the default to this option here, which is very popular. And this one is called, let me just try to get the tooltips for that, arc rotate subobject. And what it allows you to do is, we just select this object, and now I do Alt and middle mouse. You can see now everything is pivoting around the object that I have selected. If I select another object, everything's pivoting around that object instead. And if I turn one of these teapots into a mesh, and I select part of the mesh, you can see that we're actually pivoting around just the vertices that we actually have selected here. So it's actually quite a cool feature, but it's an option. You don't have to use it. You can choose any one of these three options here. So the default, as you can see, is to rotate basically around what your view is currently looking at. So if you're looking into space, it'll just be there. We're orbiting around this spot, but if we turn on this option, as we saw, we can choose an object like this one, and then our scene will actually orbit around that particular object instead. So again, that's quite a cool feature, something that you might want to try out. The next thing we're going to look at is display optimization, and let me just create a few more objects here, because some of these display optimizations need a variety of objects to actually make any sense. Let me just create some lights. And I'm also going to create some helper objects. So let me just create a tape and a grid here. And let's see, a point helper. And also I'm going to create some bones, let's say. Let me just create some bones here. There we go. So now what I can do is I can actually optimize the display of all of these objects in different ways. And to do that, we need to go to the display panel up here, which is this panel here. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to actually expand out this control panel here just to make this a bit easier to work with. And then that means I can actually expand this and we can see everything at the same time here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to actually hide some of these objects, and the first option for doing that is to hide by category. And you can see you've got these different categories here in the hide by category panel. We've got geometry, shapes, lights, cameras, helpers, space warps, particle systems, bone objects. So the teapots are geometry, the lights are lights, these helpers that I created are helpers here, and this bone chain that I've created here is made up of bone objects. So let's say I want to hide everything, I can just say all. If I want to display everything, I can just say none. Let's say I just want to display geometry. Well, the easiest thing to do is to hide everything and then untick geometry. So I can just see geometry now. Or I could just show the lights, or I could just show the bone objects. And let's say I wanted to flip around that selection. Well, I can just use the invert option here. So you can see I can now see everything apart from bone objects. That gives you a very fast and easy way of optimizing exactly what objects you want to look at in a scene. You can see you can actually tick on any or all of these. You can choose all, none, invert. You've got very quick ways of navigating and manipulating these display optimizations. Hiding biological groups is great and it makes a lot of sense, but let's say you wanted to hide just arbitrary objects, anything, any one particular thing. Well, for that, you can actually use the hide options which you've got down here. And these allow you to hide individual objects. So for instance, if I wanted to hide this teapot, I can say hide selected. If I wanted to just do this bone here, I can just hide that, hide this, choose that there, just hide that. I can hide whatever I want. And then you've got these other buttons here for working with what you've got hidden, toggling, hiding, and so on. So you can hide what you've got currently not selected, which is basically everything. I'll just undo that. I can unhide all, just undo that again. I can hide by name, which brings up a list of objects which I can pick from. I can unhide by name, so you can unhide a particular object based on its name. I can hide by hit, which allows you to just click on things and just hide them in that way. So you can basically, hide things in that manner. I'm just going to unhide all. And then another option for working is to freeze things. And what freezing means is that you can see the object, but you can't actually touch it or work with it in any way. It effectively stops you from accidentally selecting it or modifying it in various ways. So let's actually do that. Let's get this teapot, and I'm going to go and freeze that. And you can see when it freezes it, it makes it grey. I'm going to freeze this bone here. Let's freeze this teapot here, and then freeze this teapot here. Now, if I select all of these objects, you can see with the selection brackets that I've actually selected everything apart from the frozen objects. And if I hide, I'm just left with the frozen objects visible, and that's because I couldn't select them because they're frozen. So using freezing is a very cool way of optimizing the display in your scene. You can still see an object, but you can't actually affect it, which means that it's there for visual reference and you know that it exists, but you can't actually change it. And you've got very similar tools here for working with freezing. You can freeze unselected, which would be everything at the moment. You can freeze by name. You get a list of objects that you can freeze. Let's say those two. You can unfreeze all, freeze by hit. Again, it's very similar to hide. You can unfreeze by name, unfreeze by hit. So I think it's all pretty self-explanatory there. So hiding by category, hiding by individual choice, by clicking an object and just choosing to hide it. You've got options for optimizing your display in that way. And then freezing objects, they're really cool ways of optimizing, your workflow, your scene navigation, because, selecting is one of the main things about modeling. It may not seem to be such a big thing, but sometimes selecting the one single object in your scene that you actually want to work with can be quite difficult. And so, the best thing to do in that circumstance is hide everything that you don't need to work on, or freeze everything that you don't need to work on. And from then on, you can only select what you want to actually work on, and you can only, let's say we unfreeze all, you can just hide basically everything else if you want to. But if you still want to have it visible but not selectable, then you can just use freeze unselected. Just select the object you want to work on and then freeze everything else. Okay, so that's it really for optimization of display. Let's have a look at one last thing before we finish off in this chapter, and those are the quad boxes. Now, the quad boxes in 3ds Max are really cool. If you've ever used Maya, you'll know that they're very similar to the marking menus in Maya. What they allow you to do is they allow you to bring up an on-screen menu that has a number of different options in it, which allow you to work more efficiently. Rather than going up here and going to a menu and finding something here, you can click on screen anywhere with the right mouse button and it brings up a quad box. The reason why it's called a quad box is that potentially it can have 4 different quadrants. That's why it's called a quad box. So that's why, it's got quad in the name. You can have basically 4 different menus. And each menu can also branch as well. So they can actually, let's say you had an option here, you can actually have it branch off in that direction. You can see by right-clicking the viewport, I've come up with certain options. If I click on this object and right-click, then you may actually get different options And if you were in sub-object mode, if we were editing its mesh, we might get different options again. And the reason for that is that quad boxes are also contextual. So that means that whatever you've got selected or whatever you're working on, bones, teapots, whatever, it means that the quad can actually modify its behavior and come up with new commands based on what you're currently doing. Now, there's a more global toggle with quad boxes, and that's where you can actually choose different quad boxes, in other words, different selections of commands based on certain keyboard shortcuts. The three keys are Shift, Control, and Alt, and you can also use combinations of those to also access different quad boxes. So, as an example, if I just right-click, you can see I get this quad box. If I hold down Alt and right-click, you can see I get a different set of commands. If I hold down Control, I get, I think it was the same as without anything. And with Shift, you can see I get a different option with Shift than I get compared to Alt. So you can see that by holding down Shift, Alt, and not necessarily Control in this case, but in other cases, we get different quad boxes coming up. If I hold down Shift and Alt, I get another quad box. If I hold down Control and Alt, I get a different quad box. And I believe the only combo that doesn't actually do anything is Shift and Control. Yeah, if I hold down Shift and Control, I don't actually get anything. There's one more, which is Shift, Control, and Alt, and that should actually bring up a custom quad box, but that actually depends on you creating one. So as you can see, you've got lots of different options there for using commands with a quad box. You've got some commands here. As you can see, it's changed because I've selected this object. Right-click now with nothing brings up this big menu to do with this object. It's different over here, and the reason for that is this object is an editable mesh, and this is a primitive, so with a primitive you get these options. So you can see it's actually contextual. Depending on the type of geometry and the type of object, you get different commands, different options, and then if I hold down Alt, I get different options. So you can see the quad box allows you to access loads of different commands very, very quickly and very easily. And if we look at the Customize menu here, we can go into Customize User Interface, and one of the options is Quads. And this actually allows you to define different quad menus, and you can actually see the keyboard shortcuts in here as well. So you can see that for snaps, you hold down Shift and right mouse button, animation, Alt and right mouse button, modeling, Control and right mouse button, reactor is Shift and Alt, custom is Shift and Alt, lighting and rendering is Control and Alt, custom is Shift, Control and Alt. As I said, that needs to be set up though. At the moment, you can actually see it's blank. Whereas if we look at any of these others, you can see that all the options have been set up there. And then you've got track view quad, you've got viewports quad, unwrap UVW tool, schematic view. There's loads of different quads there, and these can actually be customized in various ways. So you can basically create quads that you want to work with and create custom quads and modify the quads that are already in existence and create the interface that you want to create. So, you know, you can click on this object. I can go to vertex mode. I can right click and go to edge mode. I can right click and go to face mode very quickly. I can move the object just by choosing there, rotate it. There's just loads of different options there, and they're all contained within these quad menus. So please explore them and find out what the different options are. So that's it for this chapter. We'll just finish up here, and then in the next chapter I'm just going to show you some of the most common keyboard shortcuts, some of which we've actually hit on here, but I'll show you a lot more there. And we'll also look at some of the main user interface features of 3ds Max.